All right, good morning, everyone. Okay, thank you. So today I will be talking about indigenous and local knowledge practices seeking contemporary application. Before I start my presentation, I'd like to begin with a few reflections. Sometimes 2 years ago, I was discussing the impact of fish meal industry in the Gambia with Mr. Mustafa Mane from the Gambia. The sea that once cured my rash now gives me rash. Mr. Mane's reflection symbolizes Africans' relationship with the oceans. We have a spiritual bond with the ocean, viewing and understanding the ocean space as a source of life, instrument of purification, a locus of regeneration. However, this relationship has been disrupted by years of colonialism, capitalism, and what some scholars like Camplin have called territorialization of the ocean space, especially if you're familiar with the whole buzz of the development of the blue economy. However, all hope is not lost because there is still a lot of interest in going back and retrieving the practices that were good, that were positive, that led to the conservation and encourage this reciprocal stewardship between the African people and the ocean. And so in my presentation, I will start by defining indigenous and local knowledge, give a review of historical practices for fishery sustainability with examples from Ghana, and sort of reflect on some of the colonial disruptions, again, using examples from Ghana. Challenges to applying indigenous knowledge in fisheries governance, integrating indigenous knowledge into national and regional fisheries practices, and what lessons we can learn from Ghana. And then I'll conclude my presentation. So the definition for indigenous and local knowledge has been taken from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and they define it as knowledge, the understandings, skills, philosophies developed by societies with long histories of interaction with natural surroundings. And then when it comes to local knowledge, which many of us might be familiar with, the understandings and skills developed by individuals, populations, specific to the place where they live. And so in discussing some of these practices, I would reflect or provide examples from some of the historical practices and how they are being currently applied. And the evidence I'm presenting is from my Pew project, which is the Creating Synergy Between Indigenous Practices and Scientific Knowledge, ISPIC, which we later christianed Sankofa to mean go back and retrieve it. So essentially, go back and retrieve the positive practices, positive ones. And we had over 800 participants from across 4 regions in Ghana, the Western, the Central, the Greater Accra, and the Volta region. And so I'm sort of given preliminary findings, or more or less presenting preliminary findings from that research. So some of the examples of the contributions of historical ecological practices in Ghana that were presented by the participants includes the reference of marine mammals such as whales as gods. And this reference, of course, whilst it might not necessarily be explicitly termed as a way of conserving them, the fact that they revere and do not catch them means that they are essentially conserving them. The traditional closures, such as weekly, for instance, for communities in the Volta region, they don't go fishing on Tuesdays. Other communities might not go on a different day. And then there's also weather-induced breaks. So unlike now, when there's severity in depletion, when people would see that there's a storm surge, the weather is too bad, they shouldn't go to sea, and they go because, well, if they don't go to sea, how would their families be fed? Then, when the weather is bad, people followed not necessarily the instruction, they obeyed the weather conditions, knowing that they can go to sea and catch enough for themselves when things calm down, when the weather calms down. And there's also the feeding the sea through animals and food sacrifices. Again, this is part of appeasing the gods of the land or gods of the seas to ensure bumper harvest and during festivals. And a lot of the times, this feeding the sea is done by priests or priestesses, depending on the communities. There's also rotation or modifying fishing gears throughout the year to align with what has been agreed by specific communities. There's also fishing in tandem with natural phenomena such as upwelling, reading the stars, reading the sun and the moonlight to know when to go, where to go. Again, some of these practices, or a lot of these practices, have actually been disrupted. And we're going to find out why. But before that, I want to highlight an example that I remembered from the Volta region in 2021 when we were talking about depleting fisheries with this young man, and he was reflecting on how they had this relationship, or his forefathers or ancestors had this really great relationship with the ocean. When they don't go to sea to fish because they felt the gods are resting and therefore they must not disturb the gods. When they don't catch certain marine mammals because they see them as gods, they respect them because they give them something in return. And then I was curious, I asked, so why can't you do the same now? And he said, can you not hear the vessels? Can you not hear the ships? If their noise are not disturbing the gods, how will my boat disturb the gods? And so this sort of made me think about how it is not just as simple as saying, go back and retrieve it. Because of where we are now, a lot of these practices cannot be reinvented because people do not necessarily believe in some of those things that their ancestors once believed in. And so this brings me back to the colonial disruptions. For us to also know that a lot of the things that has happened or is happening now is linked to the quest for continuous exploitation, for economic gains, which was basically the essence of colonialism. They were seeking resources and they were going to places where they can exploit. And this was the case of Ghana, and I'm trying to focus on it. I want to share this example that involves the Winnebas chief, and this is taken from Walker's paper published in 2002. And we're giving the example of the introduction of the alley net, which the chiefs at the time protested. They complained about it because they noted it is going to lead to the capture of juveniles, and therefore it is unsustainable. This is as early as 1923. The alley net was, I think, introduced in Ghana around 1850s, right? But this is the documented evidence from Walker's reflection. And in 1923, the chief of Winneba noted, the colony is much poorer sea fish supply than it was 30 years ago, and it is believed that the cause is due to the use of certain objectionable nets, which unnecessarily depletes our foreshore stock of fish. When Winneba's chiefs attempted to outlaw alley nets in the inshore area, the Colonial Secretary of Agriculture ordered the chief to withdraw the bylaws that prohibited the use of new nets. The Colonial Secretary stated that he could not agree that the chief's objections to the nets were sound because the best fishing net is the net which catches the most fish. And today, it is the same people, when I say the same people in terms of the Western ideals of conservation, that is telling us that we must conserve in a way that indigenous or local knowledge is still seen as folklore. Indigenous and local knowledge is still seen as uneducated guesses, and sometimes a lot of this conversation is actually happening without engagement with the people that are likely to be affected by these decisions. We've already learned so far in the last 3 days how the most significant problem our regions have is limitation in monitoring capacity and control, is limitation in financial and technical capacities. So the big question then is, if we continue to institute these new laws and introduce these new conservation policies without actually ensuring that we have the capacity to enforce them, we're essentially writing laws and introducing policies just for the sake of it, because we do that, but there's nobody to enforce it and ensure that it's actually implemented. And this is why reflecting and thinking back on how we can incorporate local knowledge and historical practices that are positive into the conservation of contemporary practices could in the long run be actually a more sustainable way of ensuring conservation and also equitable livelihoods. Because it's also about justice, it's also about fairness, and of course, sustainability. And then there is displacement of local governance systems, because with these new introductions meant that a lot of the policies or customary laws that were in place that ensured that the chiefs, for example, might be the ones to penalize someone or require someone to appease the gods through sacrifices, they were no longer able to do those things because they didn't have those powers. It also undermined spiritual and communal taboos. Again, from the experience from the Volta region in 2021, and also part of joining the team at the end of the Sankofa field work last year, some people talked about how religion disrupted. They are essentially no longer following some of these traditions because, well, I'm a Christian, I can't be associated with those things. A lot of people also talked about the financial implications of continuing to offer sacrifices to the gods. They could no longer afford to make the contributions necessary to be given to the priest or the chief priest that will allow him to make the sacrifices to the gods, which would obviously ensure that that connection remains. So what are the challenges hindering the application of indigenous and local knowledge in modern or contemporary fishing? Keep in mind that I'm trying to sort of ensure that the examples I'm giving is strictly from Ghana, but a lot of the narrative can also be similar to a lot of the West African countries because we share similar cultural values in terms of historically how we reverence the ocean. The idea of Mami Water, if a lot of you are familiar or from West Africa, you would also see the connection with Mami Water and the gods of fertility, and even to today, regardless of the disruptions and religious beliefs, people still believe in it. If they wanted a child and they are traditionalists, they still go to Mami Water and pray for a child. But anyways, back to the challenges. There's dearth of laws recognizing traditional governance systems and practices. Of course, we can talk about colonialism ending, but the structure that the colonial powers left was what was used in instituting a lot of the governments and the frameworks and the constitution that we currently use across so many African countries, my country included, and of course in relation to a lot of the policies. And also we've been hearing about the conservation and oceans governance in the last couple of days, and we talked about the need for signage and harmonization with the understanding that we have to see the international laws and then find ways to integrate it into national and regional laws. And so a lot of the times, we integrate these things, the international laws, without necessarily thinking about the local context and finding a way to ensure that it aligns with things that can work for us in practical terms, and things that can ensure that enforcement is also voluntary, and that way we're reducing the cost of such enforcement and not requiring to maybe have more law enforcement that we cannot afford, as is the case for many countries, including Ghana. We have so many examples about the earlier years of the closed season and how the government found it really difficult to enforce because they couldn't patrol all the landing site, limitations around fuel and every other thing. And so there is also gradual breakdown of traditional governance systems in some communities. Again, religion, people no longer really believe in gods because there is God. And because of lack of education, they can no longer make that divide or distinction between the God of their religion, Christian religion or Muslim religion, and the gods of the seas and the need to conserve the ocean, for instance. And then there's waning societal interest in indigenous practices, again, because of lack of education, in a way that allows people to differentiate. Limited scientific explanation of cultural beliefs and practices, diverse cultural practices and beliefs, one size fits all. One size policies would not fit all, of course, and perception of indigenous knowledge as unscientific. And this is actually very important to highlight because the same unscientific knowledge has been co-opted by the colonial powers at the time of colonialism and rewired and re-engineered and reconfigured as scientific and presented as theirs. There are so many evidence in literature of such things happening. And so the question then is it really unscientific? Is it really folklore, or is it a case of the way it was presented, or that the people were seen as primitive, as was the case during colonialism? And then anthropogenic pressure on traditional ecosystems. We've again heard already about the impact of IUU fishing and the desperation for people to catch the limited fish. And therefore, if you're coming to tell them, don't go and fish on Tuesday, for instance, when they have loans to repay, when they have families to take care of, when they have hospital bills, and even school fees to pay, they might not necessarily agree with that. They would simply not listen to you or make up excuses about why it is not practical for them to do that. So what are lessons we can learn from Ghana? There is continued and extensive engagement of fisher folk on pertinent issues relating to fisheries, relating to degrading ocean environment and what we can do differently. And in certain instances, they actually engage in, especially in relation to the local knowledge aspect. They are well versed, they are engaged, and they are trying to make their voices heard, even when sometimes it's not always the case. There's also involvement of fisher folk leaders in national management committees. I mean, a lot of people that I've worked with since I started working with Ghana were first the local communities. And I loved the fact, because at the end of the day, you cannot solve a problem without the people that are affected by this problem, so if you really want to solve the problem. So I have always loved how engaged they are, how passionate they are, and how open they are about sharing their knowledge and their skills and talking about the problem, in the hope that, of course, one day someone or the government or the relevant authorities would at least give a listen or try to engage them to understand how they can bring about a more equitable conservation practice that is favorable to the majority, because at the end of the day, you cannot actually please everyone. They recognize indigenous knowledge is contextual. One size does not fit all. So it's not a case of saying that what's happened in the Volta region and what they've been doing religiously might work essentially or effectively in Central region or in the Greater Accra or Western region, because again, globalization have happened, urbanization is happening, so we have to ensure that we understand the context and then engage the people on the potential way forward. Adaptations of policies to local contexts might also be required, as I've already highlighted. Overlaps in fisheries management with historical practices serve as potential entry points to make it more inclusive and equitable. And I'm so pleased to see that, of course, when the current Minister of Fisheries, before she was sworn in, some of the things she talked about was actually about indigenous knowledge and her passion for, bringing back some of the good practices. And this was clear in the side event that the Minister of Fisheries held at UNOC in June, which I was part of, where we shared the insight from our project, and where she made the commitment of ensuring and supporting the effort to ensure the reintegration and reintroduction of some of the positive practices. And if you noticed in some of the publications about the artisanal fishers not being included in the close season this year, some of the things that was noted was that they were encouraged to continue observing the holidays. So I guess for the communities that had Tuesdays as rest days, but of course, historically it was because the gods are resting, but today it is rest day. They should continue doing that. And I guess the next step you could say is having conversation with communities to think about a more realistic way of ensuring that there is a conservation policy that works for them, that is equitable. Because the reality, even when we're making recommendation on what needs to happen, we can talk about payment, we can talk about compensation. This might be realistic in the UK. This might be realistic in Malta. This is not necessarily realistic in Ghana or Nigeria. Where would they get the money from? Would they rely on development aid to be able to actually do this? Or do we need a practicable, realistic way of conserving to ensure that it is equitable, whilst also the people understanding that these changes are needed because it is in your interest and the interest of the environment and your future generations. So I think this actually calls for more engagement with local people than making recommendations that sometimes might not necessarily be practical for the local realities, especially when it comes to paying or compensating people. I believe there was a conversation we're having yesterday, and they gave an example of one of a USAID project that started training people as a way of providing alternative skills. But that program was stopped abruptly once the aid stopped coming. And so this obviously shows that such kind of approach is not a sustainable one, and therefore countries should think about more sustainable approach that aligns with their local realities in thinking about what needs to happen next. So to conclude, I want to reemphasize that fisher folk in Ghana, at least based on the work that we are doing and currently analyzing, and in fact, we have a validation exercise at some point in two of the communities that contributed the data, so we can share the findings with them and ask them what we can do next, what they think the next step should be. They acknowledge that fisheries is depleting. They recognize the need for action to be taken to address depletion. They believe that traditional fishing holidays and the rituals are effective because of the evidence of good catches they observed with their application. They also acknowledge that there is a need for a decolonial approach to knowledge integration. Their knowledge is not folklore. Their knowledge is useful and vital, and therefore should be incorporated into policy. Contemporary relevance lies in blending indigenous and local knowledge with modern science and governance. And I want to conclude by noting a quote that has been credited to Einstein: "You cannot solve a problem from the same level of consciousness that created it." And on that note, I want to thank our collaborators, the Fisheries Commission, the Fisheries Committee for West Central Gulf of Guinea, the Canoe and Gear Owners Association, the Canoe and Fishing Gear Owners Association, and the people of Ghana and fishing communities for welcoming us and for contributing the data that have made this possible. Thank you so much for listening.